Hello, good evening. My name is Sofia Lemos. I'm the Associate Curator of Public Programs at the Riga International Biennial of Contemporary Art, Riboka 2, and Suddenly It All Blossoms. And it is my pleasure welcoming you to our online series of talks and conversations. This week is one of the final ones in the series, which has been manifesting over the course of the last 19 weeks. So for those of you tuning in for the first time, the series is aiming to explore some of the main ideas, some of the main concepts that have inspired the biennial's curatorial proposition. And with this, we explore how words make worlds and how we can articulate multiple and open-ended futures. This week, we dedicate to the word fictions. And the reason for this is that it appears that the world's democracies are caught in a sort of circuitous slippage between facts, opinions, beliefs, with scientific data taking the back burner over nontruthfulness, deception, and deliberate falsehood. So we believe that artistic intervention might be one of the spaces wherein we can look for methods and techniques that allow us to look at the relationship between facts and fictions in more nuanced ways. As situated knowledges and positionality have become a widespread response to the Enlightenment inherited so-called scientific objectivity over the past 4 decades, we believe that our current era urges us to consider new models and new ideas for pursuing global justice and democracy. And I couldn't imagine a more suited thinker to help us envision how might an aesthetic education guide us in truth-making. So this evening, we're so proud to welcome McKenzie Wark, who will look at facts and fictions as practices and share with us a multidimensional critical approach to knowing the world by opening connections between intellectual silos, so between from media ecologies and political economy to post-colonial debates and information technologies. McKenzie Wark is the author of numerous books, including this year's essential reading Sensorium of the summer with Versal Books, Reverse Cowgirl from 2020, a genre and gender-binding book of autofiction and ethnography of the self, and Capital is Dead from 2019, an exploratory field guide to life in the ruins of environmental catastrophe, of pandemics, and technological transformation. She's also professor of culture and media at the New School in New York City. So without further ado, dear McKenzie, we're so thrilled for your ideas and for having you with us. So thanks so much for connecting.
Well, thanks to the Riga International Biennial for inviting me to come and talk about fiction, which I thought was a really curious and slightly sneaky kind of commission, given that like I don't write fiction at all. And it's like, why do we always ask fiction writers about fiction? Let's write somebody who doesn't do it. And I have to preface this by saying that I'm going to speak about how we think about categories like fiction in the English language. And this varies between different cultures. I'm going to talk a little bit about the etymology of some of these words we use, which are all strikingly Latinate, which means that they do resonate, at least through other European languages. But that there may be different ways we map some of these things depending on what language you live in. So I wanted to start with the notion of a difference between fact and fiction. And in English, those would be the two things that you would juxtapose. And we tend to treat them as kind of opposite things, that you know, a fact is true and a fiction is not, is the way that's supposed to work. But there's a weird way in which both those words refer to similar sorts of things in terms of their origins and etymology. They're both practices. So fiction is from fictio, from fingere, which means to shape clay, for example. So there's a way in which the word fiction comes from kind of making. And what's weird is that so does fact, or factum is an event. It's a thing that happens. There's a little more agency in fiction than fact, but they're both kind of actions in the world, events in the world. So there's like a little bit of slippage between those two terms. And I think, you know, I always like to just sort of play with the language a little bit. And what if rather than fact and fiction, we thought about ficting and facting? Like what if we re-engage the sort of active sense of those words to think that maybe they're practices that do things? And I wanted to investigate why we have a little bit of a prejudice against fiction in certain contexts. Fiction is a thing that's kind of a little restricted in where we think it's a good idea. And maybe there's a way in which this is an Enlightenment heritage, or maybe we could think of the Enlightenment as a kind of fiction about facts. There's an overarching, sort of narrative sense to Enlightenment that makes the discovery of facts appear to be the good story. And that sort of, the slippage in that strikes me as kind of interesting. That sometimes maybe we need a fiction to hold facts together. And to sort of give away the ending, spoiler alert, that maybe we can't ever actually separate them, but reconstituting the relation between facting and ficting might be our goal here. So if we think of Enlightenment as a fiction about facts, and one of its aims is sorting fact from fiction through method, and science would be the shorthand for that. And probably elsewhere in the world, but particularly in the United States, kind of loss of faith, interestingly, in the fiction of science as able to reliably generate facts is where we're at. And undoing that and counteracting it presents you with a huge kind of ideological and cultural problem, in the sense that you have to sort of defend the fiction that this is a good way to produce facts. Because it is, because it works, even if it hasn't always worked, and even if there are problems with how that happens in practice. The other thing is that coming out of the Enlightenment is not just a version of knowledge that's science, but also a kind of facticity in fiction. Like it's connected to the production of the reverse, and that's the novel. It's maybe a much less direct kind of connection. But the notion that there ought to be a fiction that has the factual qualities of everyday life and of emotions that people can experience strikes me as the other side of a kind of Western Enlightenment inheritance. Now, on the one hand, Enlightenment is a fiction about facts, but it's also a kind of factual approach to fiction, where we kind of like our books to be filled with kind of details that are kind of recognizable descriptions of the world. And that's the thing that kind of validates it. Now, there's a kind of unpicking of part of that inheritance that's sometimes referred to as like a postmodern moment. It's not a very helpful term anymore. Like I remember the intellectual struggles of the 80s. It's like, oh my God, did we do that one to death? And it's now a kind of right-wing meme. So I don't want to press too heavily on that. But there is a kind of critique of science that sometimes is folded into that category, which I think was doing something a little different. And I'm thinking here of science studies, of Latour, of Haraway. And there's a way of trying to look for the residues of fiction in the scientific enterprise. So to what extent have fictions from particular situations in the everyday life of people with an interest in the production of science being drawn into it and kind of need to be found, so that we discover that even if science's ambition is a kind of universal knowledge that doesn't imply any particular human subject, it never quite reaches that. It's always a kind of a goal that it can never quite approximate. So it's actually maybe a useful thing to be able to situate where a particular knowledge comes from, and kind of understand that the subject that produces it is in fact not universal. That science, for example, is for a long time was a bunch of white guys who had certain assumptions about the world built into what they would study, what they would consider evidence, and so on. So we have a kind of science studies sort of reprocessing of the fictions that are in the production of facts. So there's a critique of science, but maybe one can think also of a kind of parallel critique of culture. And this one's going to sound a little counterintuitive, but maybe the critique of culture that we need is to do with there always being a residue of fact specific to circumstances in a culture, that culture is actually not free. We do have a sense of what's valuable in culture, and particularly in art, as a kind of free creation. But maybe the problem is not so much the creation as the sort of groundedness in too much facticity, that we never in a culture quite get far enough away from assumptions about things that are real or about certain kinds of facticity that hide other ones, that are the embeddedness of this level of facticity in, for example, a novel, is then blinding us to this other kind of facticity that we might want to approach instead. So in parallel to science studies as critique of the production of fact, maybe we need a kind of cultural studies that you can think of as a critique of the production of fiction. One could think of those as parallel enterprises, and I'm sort of slightly strangely characterizing the second one, but which maybe need to come together in ways that we haven't really quite figured out yet. Now, what would be a fine art might be thoughtful ways of unpicking how situations cleave facts from and to fiction. And I'm going to use sort of this old-fashioned English word, cleave, that is one of those wonderful Derridian words that means a thing and its opposite at the same time. To cleave is to hold to and to separate from at the same time. So, maybe the kind of cleaving of fact from fiction is the thing about which one really needs to invent practices. And I think that's a thing that art could now do. Would that not be a sort of valuable art to have? And it might have a speculative dimension, a kind of experimental dimension, but how are fact and fiction woven in this particular encounter? How do they cleave? Might be the kind of thing we could pay a little bit more attention to. So maybe there's an art practice that's creative and critical, ficting and facting, to return us to those terms. That's playing with not just the kind of paranoid reading of certain kind of production of knowledge. So let's sort of move out of the Foucault era in that sense into a different one that might be about how we would do that a little bit differently. And I just want to mention, I think that's partly what the work of the late Bernard Stiegler was about. And Stiegler passed just this year, and his attention, sort of contra Foucault, looking at production of knowledge as power, his attention to the long loops of the pedagogic as forms of mediated production of moments of individuation for subjects and groups. Like, that strikes me as kind of powerful and worth exploring as a kind of alternative to always doing the kind of paranoid reading that only finds, fiction in fact, and usually fictions that have power attached to them. And sort of exploring a little bit more fully what's the production of a kind of counter knowledge where facting and ficting could have a different relationship. So it does seem like a moment where we have too many bad fictions. I don't know if this is unique to the United States. I suspect not. We're definitely in the thrall of it here. People are believing crazy conspiracy theories. It's like some kind of immersive game that some huge population has found itself attracted to, which I'm not even going to name because that immediately makes it resonant in ways that I don't want it to be. But it's super creepy that themes from the Protocols of Elders of Zion are turning up as kind of conspiracy theories in 21st century America. And I suspect elsewhere as well. I think kind of crazy talk is branching out. One I will mention is the return of flat earthers. And there's a certain charm to that because it seems harmless. I remember watching a kind of fabulous documentary about flat earthers. And what was crazy about it is how scientific their approach to it was. Like they had access to scientific instruments to try to prove that the earth is flat, and then it's producing results that don't conform to their theory. And then they're like producing, extraneous additional theories to explain why the evidence didn't add up. So it's kind of like, oh, you were kind of dedicated to producing a fact here, and this, like, something was right about this, but then the relationship of fact to fiction ends up in this crazy kind of relationship at some point. I do have to mention my favorite bit of flat earth belief systems, which is that Australia doesn't exist. Because part of it is that the Southern Hemisphere doesn't exist, and they have ways of tracking flights and stuff that allegedly proves it. The fact that there aren't a lot of direct flights between countries in the Southern Hemisphere somehow proves that the Southern Hemisphere is not there, which is, kind of delightful and also not completely true. But my favorite one is Australia doesn't exist, and it's all a cover-up that the British really dumped their convicts overboard in the ocean. And there's like a huge plot to cover up the fact that they did that, which now, of course, NASA is in charge of keeping the conspiracy. And as an Australian, I'm apparently being paid by NASA to pretend I'm from a country that doesn't exist. And the marsupials are all genetically engineered fakes or something. And you gotta love the inventiveness of that. And, you know, if these things didn't become implicated in how people think about other things in the world, you'd find it a delightful fiction. But the problem is it then starts to connect up to anti-vaxxers and climate denial and all sorts of other ways in which you might want to point to the fiction being wrong here, but there are actual facts in some of this stuff, but articulated to the wrong fiction ends up being why this stuff is problematic, difficult, and sometimes even dangerous. So a question one might ask is like why did we end up with such a huge problem in the relationship between practices of facting and ficting? And I honestly don't know. Like I can't generate a fact about that, but I can generate a speculative story. I can, you know, fict my way through it if you like. And then we just have to bear in mind that I'm offering a fiction that could be partly explanatory, that would then require additional facts to find. So there's a role here maybe for the speculative fiction that might be true. And the one I want to offer is maybe there's a kind of merging of the techniques of ficting and facting at the level of a kind of media infrastructure, at the level of cultural use of media at certain times of day, and to sort of make that more concrete in a sense. I mean, we're kind of doing everything through the same interfaces on our phones and computers, whereas before there would have been some separation. It's kind of not accidental, although it now seems strange in a way that there was a whole industry that built game consoles that looked completely different to computers, even though those two devices could do pretty much the same things. But one was supposed to be on a desk to work on. The other one was supposed to be in the living room to play on. We used to have kind of separations between some technologies, or separations between times when certain things would be used, or genres. You know, you might be looking at a movie in school, but it would be a different kind of movie and shown at a different time to the one you would see that's fiction, that's entertainment. And there's a kind of collapsing of a lot of those boundaries, given that you can access any media at any time. For a lot of people, work is no longer 9 to 5, but it stretches throughout the day. And so then you're looking for little moments when you can take a break in that, and then using the same devices to interact with both the ficting and the facting. And so maybe there's a techniques involved in how we end up confused about which one of those is which. There's a lot of mimesis of, you know, one genre pretending to be another. Sort of comedy television news was one of the places this started in the United States. And at some point you're like, wait, I'm getting all of my actual news from the comedy version of the news show, but it's entertainment. Yeah, it's not really meant to be generating a kind of factual relation to the world. So I can say the internet is complicated genre, where genre is what sets expectations for how you're supposed to read what you're viewing or reading or listening to. And there's a kind of bleeding of one genre into the other. There's a kind of entertainment versions of what would otherwise be formally, factually oriented modes of production. So I think that's kind of confused a lot of people as to, just exactly what you're looking at. And this is before we even get to the kind of intentional kind of construction of things that all look like, mimic the sort of cadences and genre conventions of reliable knowledge. So, for example, climate denial is based on a whole kind of production of what looks like the scientific, but kind of isn't. So it sort of mimics the forms and characteristics. Same with the anti-vaxxers, for example. Same to some extent with the flat earthers. It has the aura of factiness that kind of makes it look like the fiction is something other than what it is. So it's kind of tempting to blame the ficting entirely for this. And maybe there's a lot to be said indeed for the production of bad fictions. But I want to sort of offer a little kind of caveat about that. which is there's a sense in which the claim that fiction is always the bad thing has a kind of theological basis. Like fiction is the work of the devil. It's the devil that creates false appearances, and truth is kind of invisible and spiritual, or only discoverable secondhand through a scientific apparatus that's not immediately visible. So don't believe the sort of ficting surfaces of the world is like a key belief in a kind of Christian mindset. And part of the problem with that is the ficting, the thing to be suspicious about, is coded as feminine, and factual is coded as masculine. And it tends to privilege a kind of male authority and the authority of the voice over the authority of appearances. So I want to push back a little bit against the whole chain of assumptions that can be nested in. Our problem is only with fiction, and facts are a thing that, you know, that we can rely on. Because you notice how that always goes wrong. If ever you end up in some kind of social media interaction with some crazy person who believes a conspiracy theory, the first thing they do is, I will tell you the facts, you know. And the thing is that the facts might actually be true. It's how they're kind of arranged and organized, and their relation to the fiction is the kind of the problematic part. But it's like, yeah, you haven't got it back there. It's, you know, it's the relation to the fiction is kind of the problem with it. So yeah, I want to be a little careful of suspicion of artifice and that connection of fiction with the unreal. And because it also tends to connect to a kind of faith in nature. And again, this is an old figure. It's a kind of faith in nature as also a state of ignorance, the state of Eden before the fall, as if knowledge were a bad thing that took you away from some essence of the facticity of the world. That could be known through some privileged method. That can also be a somewhat dangerous line of reasoning as well. So yeah, often artifice is rejected as feminine, but then also even by women is a thing. To what extent is there a strain of feminism that wants to reject artifice because artifice equals trans women, right? Such as myself. So it's like, yeah, you're the bad thing, we are the true thing. And it becomes a sort of paradoxical claim to the facticity of femininity through direct contact with its facticity as a masculine virtue over and against who you are going to claim are men who are using feminine techniques to produce a false image of themselves. So like that one gets weirdly squirrely in terms of how those categories are laced together.
McKenzie, and in today's realities, how do the notions of post-truth and fact relate to each other? Also considering this idea of how theological currents associate fact with truth and fiction with artifice, can we disarticulate these ideas from the building blocks of realities from metaphysical discourse?
Yeah, there might be a little complexity to the connection between post-truth and the notion of fact. Maybe facts aren't the whole truth. And the paradoxical thing about the true is that it might require an element of the fictive in order to articulate the facts in a way that the facts can actually resonate. And then the problem is making the connection. So, so like data in itself doesn't really tell you very much and can also be highly unreliable in all sorts of ways. Like it's not a neutrally produced thing, like some particular instrument produced it. It was selected in certain ways. So part of the story, part of the ficting, if you like, that makes the facting able to produce truth is the relationship between the two of them. So to be only kind of critiquing the fictive end is sort of maybe not really getting us back towards productions of knowledge that might actually be kind of helpful again. And one of the places I'm going with this is like maybe we actually need to produce more fiction. Maybe there are other fictions that would help us articulate facts again in a particular way. Amitav Ghosh has made that argument in relation to what's the role of the novel in trying to understand climate change, and seems to think you can re-articulate the realist novel to do it, or what I call a bourgeois novel. Not entirely sure you can, But that's sort of a real problem. Like, what's the ficting that will hold together certain patterns of facting that we kind of need to pay attention to? Like kind of massive climate disruption that's kind of happening as we speak. You know, California's on fire. Australia, my homeland, was on fire last summer in unprecedented ways. We're kind of having one of the worst hurricane seasons. This kind of flooding we're not even talking about in the Midwest. And that's just the bits of America that I know. Like, I don't even know what's happening elsewhere. So how do you articulate those facts in ways that make them things that are actionable? Like, that seems to me to be the reason to think we need fictions. And there's maybe a reason to think of art practices then also as a kind of research and development on how to reweave practices of facting and ficting in ways that could be useful. Right, artists make shit up, but there's a way in which art connects to facticity in interesting ways. So maybe there are kind of practices there that we could kind of encourage and develop. So in general, what I'm sort of arguing is that the return to an approximation to the world, the return to facticity, to kind of actionable knowledge requires the production of artifice. That one has to kind of move away in order to move back. There's sort of like a double step in producing, forms of perceiving, knowing, and feeling together. And that might be the thing that sort of above all else at the moment might need working on, more than a politics kind of knowledge-making practice might be the thing. And one could think of that as also a politics. I just think it's maybe a little bit of a restrictive frame. But, how do we produce, articulate, and embed in subjectivity ways of knowing through practices of ficting and facting seems to me to be the thing that's kind of in crisis. And maybe not surprising, like all of the ones that we know about, like all of the, well, not all, but, the vast majority of the ficting and facting that we know about are products of the Holocene, a kind of geological era that clearly has ended. You might not want to call this the Anthropocene, call it what you like, I don't care, but that it's a different geological era. And all of our knowledge producing practices are from a different one. Caveat to that, like that strikes me as really key. So how do you produce knowledge for a different geology? Where would you go to even answer that question? I mean, there are actually ways to answer that. It would seem that Australian Indigenous knowledge in some parts of the country dates back to the late Pleistocene. So there's already a change in geological era involved in a way of telling stories, in a way of deciding what's true and what's real. So in ficting and facting. So there may very well be Indigenous knowledges that do have something by way of reweaving the ficting and facting for what's clearly changed into a different geological era, where certain background assumptions about the sort of geological state of the world, the climactic state of the world, just don't even hold anymore. But how to think that in a way that, or do that in a way that scales, that's not for a small band of people, but is for a planet of 7 million people, I think it's going to take a hell of a lot of artifice to come back to producing a kind of, and here's the return of that word, a technics, that would enable ficting and facting for populations that articulate. And the thing that the ficting connects to more than the facting part is desire. You're sort of negotiating between the real and desire is kind of the thing that any knowledge has to do. And it has to concede certain things to desire if it's to be effective at all. So that would seem to be a way to kind of demarcate the problem. So more artifice. And here I just want to note, and this etymology is really kind of spurious, but the words artifice and artifact seem maybe etymologically linked to fact and fiction. That one's a little, I'm kind of like, takes a little hand waving to make that one work, but it does seem kind of curious that if you think about the word artifact and artifiction, and they're Latinate words that may resonate in other languages outside English, how do we bring the artifice of making the artifact, which is, among other things, an art practice, how do those become a praxis in the 21st century? That would seem to me to be a key thing to work on at the moment. So maybe what can negotiate between fact and fiction is actually a third thing. So what would be the thing that does that? And that third thing could be a story, or it could be a concept. So if you think of the fict in ficting or fiction, and the fact as sort of like isolated elements, some of which you have some way of verifying, some you don't. And then there are practices that those are articulated into. So to what extent is one of those story, as I've kind of already suggested, some sort of bifurcating fiction a little bit into element and into form. And the thing you would say about the form of narrative is that it's linear. The whole point of narrative is, A happens, which causes B to happen, which causes C to happen. You can have branching structures, like you can elaborate this in all sorts of ways. But the linearity of it is the thing that's kind of key to storytelling, to narrative. And that's interesting, useful, it'll do things for you, but they're also kind of traps and ways in which it really doesn't produce useful knowledge. This is Hume, right? Just because one thing follows another doesn't mean there's a causal relationship between the two. Maybe there are kind of sheets or showers of elements happening that stories weave together. And we sort of, from the way stories weave ficts together, imagine it weaves facts together in the same way, when it's sort of not going to. Like maybe the world doesn't actually operate in the way that narrative does. So I'm a little skeptical about storytelling, even though I do it. We all do. But I want to ask, to what extent is narrative ordering a line? And when we have access to at least one other thing, which I'm going to call concept, and to what extent is a concept a way of organizing a plane rather than just a line of either ficts or facts, or a mixed set of both? So to what extent is it possible not just to narrate in a line, but to kind of understand in a field? And is conceptual thinking and writing the thing that does that? So I've sort of said this before, and it has a little bit of slightly different resonance in this context. And it's a way of explaining what I think a concept is. So a good fact is mostly true, but about something in particular, right? So a fact is mostly true, but about that particular thing. And this is the limit of empiricism. You can pile those up, it doesn't really amount to much. And the limit also of narrative, you can put them in a line, but then you might mistakenly think, A produces B produces C in some sense. So, but the facts themselves mostly true, which is good. But maybe what a concept does is kind of grab them by the handful and arrange them in a plane. So a good concept is slightly true, but about a lot of things, right? So it contains more ficting than the narrative does. And if one knows that's what a concept does, one can use it with a certain amount of safety. The problem is we've tended to treat the concept as more true than the sheet of facts that it arranges. And that's the kind of theological temptation that still runs through philosophy. That's the temptation in Plato, that's the temptation in Christianity as Platonism for the masses, that the idea is something that sort of subtends and is more real than the appearances, whether they be ficts or facts, that it organizes. So you kind of take that away. Concepts, actually, they're only slightly true. You sort of demote them, but they can have this interstitial quality of like organizing planes of what I'm calling ficts and facts in an act of ficting and facting together. All right, so I seem like I'm making up a lot of terms here, and this is starting to get a little abstract, but I want to kind of suggest a kind of set of practices for experimentally producing knowledges that is a thing that art could now be. And then to think that, again, in the era of internet as a thing not designed to do any of this at all, right? Like the 21st century internet we're using now is basically designed to extract surplus information and weaponize it, use it as a form of surveillance, and find out how to sell us a bunch of crap based on the information extracted. So internet's not designed anymore for the production of knowledge. It's designed for the production of surplus for a ruling class. So we're trying to use an infrastructure that's not built to do any of this at all to redesign practices of weaving fact and fiction together such that we could act in the world and stop ourselves from destroying it. Like, that's sort of basically where we are in the 21st century. And so that's hard and maybe kind of impossible, and maybe calls on us to kind of rethink genres of knowledge production in the age of kind of internet technics, to be a little cautious in some ways, but then also to kind of experiment and think of that as being, you know, perhaps what art practice kind of now is. And one of the extra thing one has to add to this, and I promise that's like the last extra thing I'm going to add, one thing that maybe gets heightened in the 21st century is the question of whether the author herself is a fact or a fiction. So to what extent am I the fiction, or to what extent is it a fact that I am this person that I claim to be? Now, of course, there are, you know, sort of pseudonyms and fake authors has a long history, but there's maybe a kind of exaggerated sense in which that becomes a problem when you kind of have no idea who you're interacting with on Twitter. The notion of the sock puppet account is now kind of a commonplace. So one has to kind of complicate the diagram in relation to ficting and facting a little bit by thinking through also the fict or factive dimension of the author themselves, and as being something that's much less verifiable than it used to be, and a source of a whole series of problems. And maybe this is a way to think also the distinction in genre that we make in English between fiction and non-fiction. And isn't that curious that, and I don't know what it's like in other languages, but like fiction, it's clear, it's made up, somebody made up a story. But other kind of book or piece of writing is called non-fiction. It's defined negatively as not being the other thing. It doesn't have a positive specification. It always struck me as really kind of strange. And it's a claim about what the author is doing. And it's a claim also about the factual nature of the author as well, right? That the author is a person who's factual, making something that has claims to be factual. But maybe we want to play with that a little bit. And the thing I wanted to end in is just sort of my own interest in playing with genres of what you could call autofiction and autotheory, and where adding auto in sense of autobiographical to theory as a way of situating it. So let's make bring the knowledge producer into the story and take away the sort of universal abstract subject, the fiction that often claims to be writing philosophy, and specify exactly who and you know what that body happens to be doing, what its history is, and so on. So I think there's something to be said for introducing that element into the production of theory. I'm also interested in autofiction. One of the last books I wrote, Reverse Cowgirl, sort of steps out of writing theory into writing something else. It's like memoir, but I think memoir makes claims to the facticity of the author, and autotheory doesn't do that. Like the self that's writing could have a much more fictional quality. That's kind of a little bit more open. So both the sort of strange thing is that both nonfiction and fiction, as often produced, seem to produce the author herself as a fact, and maybe questioning that a little bit more, and allowing the author, both in herself and in the reader's mind, is about who that person is, to kind of be thinking about the fictive nature of who is producing the knowledge in the first place. And I think that for once, maybe literature's been a little bit ahead of visual art and opening that space up. I can think of some super interesting auto-fictive work that's been happening in parallel on the art world. In fact, maybe drawing those two things together again might be interesting as well. Warhol's an interesting case. Like, to what extent is Warhol a fictional creation as well as the work Like, to what extent is the person the work? All right, so the last thing I want to say is what we're talking about is a kind of secularization of the author of the work, right? There's a way in which what happened with roots in Enlightenment, the kind of critical negation of that was Romanticism, the attempt to synthesize those things in modernity, the kind of rerouting back to Romanticism that was the postmodern. And please just let me have that very simple diagram of 100 years of cultural history. It's obviously not going to hold for very long. But one of the things you can think about is a kind of incomplete secularization. It's no longer a classical art in the sense that it's not claiming to approximate a model given by God's creation, that the writer or artist is themselves the creator. But there's a way in which that elevates the author or the artist into the status of the father or the God that we've sort of been wrestling with, and a little incompletely in its sort of displacement by the arrival of women writers, women artists, and so forth. But maybe to kind of take away that sense of the artist as creator might be helpful, and to think also that those are fictive creations of the situations that give rise to them, to further secularize that last piece of what we have, this sort of old-fashioned sense of the originator. So to what extent is there a ficting and facting of both the artist and the work, the artificer and the artifact in that sense? And what we might be trying to look for is ways of thinking. I hesitate to say new, because maybe new is not what we always need. And I was gesturing towards Indigenous knowledge to kind of say maybe we need things that are old, and the new things are what misled us. But what are ways of reweaving ficting and facting together in ways that might produce actionable knowledge that negotiates between the real state of the world and our desires in such a way that we can collaboratively exist and function in the ruins of this civilization that we all sort of really know is over, such that we might start to build another one. Thank you.
Thank you, McKenzie. This has been truly what a journey. I feel that there's so much in your proposal that opens up space for thinking about complementarity, for modes of knowing the world that are multiple, that are overlapping, as opposed to the kind of centuries-old universal constants and oppositions. So I'd like to start by sort of relating some of these ideas to the main ideas that nurtured the biennial's proposition, particularly with how fabulation and artistic fiction become strategies of survival against grand narratives in history, but also against most claims of doomsday and disarray in today's world. And another thread that I thought was particularly interesting in this journey, and that you brought about in relation to our biennial, is really how to nurture sets of practices that experimentally produce knowledge, and that you linked before to ways of perceiving, of sensing, of feeling, and of knowing. So with this, I'd like to jump to my first question, which has to do with this idea of that the access to the world, if not all of it, is mediated through the internet. And in one of your recent books, Capitalism, that you argue that information has become a new mode of production, and that it has seeped into worldview, which is clear in the sort of flat earth and other examples that you've mentioned before, and that increased the idea that there's no room for opposition in the internet. There's only room for the affirmation of oneself and their group. So, with considering these bad fictions and the way in which they're creating larger forms of polarization, distrust in dialogue, and eventually interpersonal muteness and refusal to listen, I wonder if the practices of facting and ficting inform comradely and collaborative action forward against the protocols of the internet and algorithmic governance.
Yeah, isn't that a kind of a key problem at the moment? that we kind of choose to believe the things that kind of affirm existing ideas about ourselves. And it's very kind of hard to unpick that. And maybe in a sense, no knowledge really succeeds unless it does kind of articulate one's desires in a way. And indeed, one of the things as a teacher one is attempting to do, and this also goes all the way back to Plato, is you're trying to encourage the love of knowledge itself. And that can go wrong in all sorts of horrible ways. And it's like, no, don't love the authority, don't love the teacher, love your own capacity to learn. Like that's sort of the thing that you're attempting to produce. Doesn't always work. Like not everybody falls in love with learning. So what other paths to that kind of connecting of desire with, some reliable knowledge of the world are available strikes me as a kind of a key person, particularly at a time when it gets very hard to articulate that. The internet is sort of structured around much more short-term kinds of desires, the little dopamine hit of the little morsel of fresh information that's sort of like delivered in front of you over and over again. It's kind of like a repetitive thing and it doesn't build. Hard to get anybody to read an entire book anymore. But then maybe there are, I don't want to sound like a old conservative about that. Like, we didn't read the whole book back in the day either, to be honest, But yeah, how there are ways of articulating desire with the techniques that we're given in such a way that you can feel like people are making progress on articulating their own desires to knowledge.
Yeah, and one of the key issues with world knowing and models of knowledge production, which we've inherited from the Enlightenment period, is that they're also world making. So I wonder if there's space for accountability when we refer to ficting and facting as practices.
Yeah, that accountability is a kind of interesting category there. And it does make me think of, and I'm not the right person to be speaking about it because I'm not an ethnographer of Australian Indigenous cultures at all. But I learned a lot from Eric Michaels, who was looking at Western desert practices, and everything is divided in that society into two complementary halves. And so for any given piece of sacred knowledge, authorized sort of speakers from one half are going to tell or perform a certain piece of sacred knowledge, and an authorized person from the other half has to verify that it's being done correctly. So it's like, wow, you guys have been doing peer review probably for thousands of years. It's kind of genius. So now, of course, it doesn't mean that the story remains exactly the same, and it may well be adapted. And it's a culture with a different understanding of temporality anyway. So whoever the sacred story is performed now is what always was already. It has a different relation to time. But it is a form of accountability made by kind of division and reciprocity. So those roles are changeable as well. So yeah, I wonder about, there are people who are skeptical in the academic world about peer review, and it doesn't always work. But it was kind of a good idea, that before you're kind of authorized to say something, who validates that that? So who can already say something about that as whether it's valid or not. And we kind of lost a lot of those practices, is what we noticed went away in the era of the kind of internet techniques, of the production of information. And we're sort of looking for ways to reestablish it. The scariest version of that is trust the algorithm. And there's a lot of weight being put behind that. And the pushback is, well, the algorithm is producing like bogus results. It's not accurate. But we're now being asked to trust it even when it's not. It's like, oh yeah, so it produced, it recalibrated all these British, school leaving results, and yeah, maybe it's a bit arbitrary, but let's just go with that. So unless you've undermined the sort of the role of humans as validators and then firstly said the algorithm will do it better, and then admitted it sort of won't. And then you just have to double down on the attack on anybody whose claim to knowledge might actually be valid. So that's kind of where we are. But yeah, what would be, because like the thing is I don't really have an answer, but yeah, what are systems of accountability that people can strike as a kind of bargain with each other in any kind of production of knowledge situation? That would be exactly what to think about, even just with your friends. Yeah, what truth are we owed? What truth are you allowed to hide? When is somebody going too far off base? A thing that can be called into question.
I quite enjoy this idea of reciprocity as a means to forego of teleological narratives, but also predetermined futures, and instead of building them collaboratively and in exchange. So I'd like to continue talking about reconciling ways of knowing the world in the age of the Anthropocene. And I wonder if you could expand on this idea that knowledge must negotiate desire.
Yeah, the thing is, if you press on this too hard, the entire business model of Google and Facebook and whatever just completely starts to fall apart. Like it's based on extracting a quantifiable surplus that's actionable out of the production of information where it doesn't matter if that's noise, which is not too different to how finance works now. You can trade on volatility and noise just as much as on anything else. So when you find ways to extract a surplus out of information, whether it's valid or not, like that's when you really step into kind of a simulated universe, and also a sort of very chaotic one. It doesn't have your sort of paranoid view of it as being a kind of hyper-organized matrix. Doesn't quite work anymore. It's like it's a kind of matrix of noise is the thing that we're kind of inside of. But mostly because of the business model that's attached to that production of information. But I don't want to make it seem like the broadcast era was like the golden age, because like that was the Cold War. There were just these like huge, ridiculous consensus stories that you didn't have to believe them. Like, and it's one thing Zizek is good on. Like ideology is not a thing you have to believe. You just have to concede that it exists. And that happened in both East and West. Like there were these like ridiculous consensus ideologies. You just had to agree that it was there. You don't have to actually believe in it. And your not belief affirmed it just as much as believing it did, is kind of the problem with it. But everybody was obliged to have a relationship to the same story, like the same fictions. That's the thing that kind of went away. So before you would have had your little bubble in relation to like one consensus fantasy. Now it's sort of like little competing bubbles of sort of micro consensus fantasy all in relation to each other. So yeah, and as a matter of self-preservation, a lot of people just have to do that. Like you really just have to hide yourself from what most other people believe and want to talk about, just as otherwise you're just not going to function in the world. So I don't make the bubble the problem in a sense. Maybe it's the way bubbles self-constitute themselves, and the fact that we're never trained how to do it would be more the problem. But to just kind of confess how I'm situated and implicated in that, I have a Twitter alt, like I have a second account, and it is just other trans women, none of whom talk about transphobes at all. We're not even going to mention J.K. Rowling. It just never happens. So we can just live in our little bubble where we're like nobody in this little space is going to hate on us, nor do we have to talk about the fact that they hate us. We're just going to shitpost each other. And yeah, that's my bubble. And I'm not the only person who's in bubbles like that. Just otherwise, like you're just not going to survive. Like there's so much of the world is trying to hate you.
And you mentioned before that the current models that we have for knowing the world belong to this previous geological era, the Holocene. So I'm really interested as well in what happens to the concepts of the human, the body, gender, when they become markers of something called user in the Anthropocene. So I wonder how this idea of cleaving, of something being itself and its opposite at the same time, might help us formulate an aesthetic practice for the arts. And I wonder if you could give some examples as well.
Yeah, I want to start with people who work through heteronyms. Of course, I'm going to start with Pessoa, right? As kind of like just the genius of that to write this really first class poetry through different heteronyms as different people. And then in English Book of Disquiet, which I think also was supposed to be a heteronym project, but it's never finished. That's sort of like a metatext kind of around it. So there's ways in which people working in heteronyms are kind of already, sort of in really interesting ways, treating the author as fictable. But then it's the relation between the heteronyms is what sort of produces the tension. And then to go from one end of Europe to the closer to Latvia, Kierkegaard is the other example. It's like the great northern example of the, and there it's nesting. So it's the introduction by one person to a text by another. So there's like a nesting relation of heteronyms there. And to kick it into the art world, and I blanked on her name when I was speaking before, but I really wanted to mention Lynn Hirschman-Leeson. It's a super interesting artist who produced a whole, sort of heteronymic body under the name of Roberta. And the thing that was so great about this is, like, she got documentation in this name. I forget Roberta's surname, but Roberta had documents that were like legal. Roberta had a job for a while as like a secretary or something. I'm sorry, Lynn, that I'm going to mess up the details of your story because I don't have it in front of you. And the part that was truly wild is Roberta went on dates and met men in an open space in like a plaza or something. And there's photographs of Roberta, who always looks the same, is always dressed the same. It's the same wig as Lynn in the original version of this. And someone is taking pictures with a telephoto lens. You only see the man's back, like she's protecting the privacy of people that she met, kind of thing. And it's like, that's just so wild and so much a kind of 21st century, it's like Tinder already exists in this world, and your Twitter alt. It's like she's working with a kind of language that we now have, but doing it decades before it actually exists. Then the later iteration is other people get to be Roberta. So there's a kind of moving on from that and a sort of separating out of the personality, which reminds me of Warhol sending, I think, Gerald Malanga out on tour. Like Warhol didn't want to do the college tour to promote one of the books, so Gerald did it in a wig, So there's kind of like play with these things, and where, scandal, because this turns out not to be Warhol, but who's to say it's not, like who's to say Roberta is not as real as Lynn is in a certain sense. Yeah, I don't know quite how she feels about that. And it's wild that she made a movie where Tilda Swinton plays like 3 or 4 characters all at the same time, kind of thing. So I think like unpicking and playing in that space like really has a lot going for it. And it's like maybe there's a kind of and it's like the pharmacon. You could really like poison people on the idea of the artist or the intellectual by exposing them as fakes and frauds. On the other hand, maybe it's helpful to show how fictional that is, to not rest everything on the notion of the kind of creative authority of the writer, who's really just standing in the place of God. Yeah, this was like Romanticism makes that turn. Like there is new creation in the world. Special category of people called poets and artists gets to do it. And for someone like Raymond Williams, the struggle is to democratize that creative capacity. I think the more interesting radical strategy is like there are, firstly, yes, you can democratize that creative capacity, but it's all kind of drawing from a commons. Like all of these things are reworking a culture that's a common possession. Like that would be sort of the kind of situationist take on that.
Dear McKenzie, it's been so thrilling to journey with you through these fields and plains, through these places where we might weave fact and fiction as world-making practices, which we find so crucial to navigating life in the ruins of late capitalism. So we're very grateful as well for ending on this note of playfulness as a means of democratizing creative capacities against both consensual ideologies and crazy talk. So thank you again so much for mapping this sort of situationist détournement and for bringing together fact and fiction. So again, big thank you, and thanks to everyone who tuned in today and also who tuned in throughout our series. Thank you.
Sophia, thank you for having me.